Hey everyone, it's Thomas, and I am doing my Teach Back today on Chapter 7 of Community Youth Practices, the chapter on adolescent sexuality and positive youth development. The first time took me about 23 minutes, so we're going to take about 10, 11 minutes off of that and actually get through this quickly. And so just where we're going is we're going to start with an introduction, do the summary of the chapter, look at how it can be applied in the local context, and then finally close on just looking at scripture and what the Bible has to say about adolescent sexuality. And so to start, just briefly explore this quote from Russell and Andrews, the authors of this book, where it says, "We live in a culture that is not comfortable with sexuality or with adolescence, and least comfortable of all with the notion of adolescent sexuality." Obviously, that this concept, this idea, poses a problem, and I know I've personally experienced those that struggle with youth and sexuality, and so despite the uncomfortableness of this topic, it is necessary, and it's definitely necessary in the lives of our youth. And so the chapter gives us an understanding of sexuality, and it's in contrast of how it's normally understood. When people say adolescent sexuality, so often we go to the negative. We go to that, oh well, they're having sex too often, it's too early, they're having sex with too many people, they're going out, they're getting pregnant. And there's this very negative view about adolescent sexuality, and it's very focused on the problems, focused on deficits. When in reality, sexuality, especially for adolescents, because it's when they awaken, it's when they come to start to discover their sexuality, is so much more than just the behaviors. It is attitudes. It is the behaviors, of course. It's also their identity. It goes so much beyond, the fact that they might be having sex and they might be getting pregnant, to they're having their first crush, they're kissing, they're going on their first date. All of that is incorporated into this idea of sexuality. The quote from Russell and Andrews is that sexuality in this chapter is used to refer to the broad range of feelings, behaviors, and attitudes that youth experience as they develop through childhood to young adulthood. It's so much broader, and it's so necessary to their lives. The final note that we see is that healthy adolescent maturation includes sexuality development. Youth don't grow up without growing up as sexual beings, and if we don't engage in this process with them, we're doing them a disservice. And so now that we have this concept of sexuality being so much more than just the act of sexual intercourse, we look at some of the challenges of why it's so hard in our culture to engage in this process with youth. And one is because of the sexual and social maturity gap. And that's based on the fact that our kids and our youth are reaching a sexual maturity, a sexual awareness, far before they have their social maturity, their social independence, their social awareness. They might be sexually mature, but still living in their parents' house under their parents' rules. And so there's a whole lot of tension here where youth are like, well, I have these urges, I have these desires, and yet my parents are saying this. And that also leads into the next point, that there are mixed messages about their sexuality. From their parents, they might be like, oh, well, sex is only for procreation. It's only in the confines of a loving and caring marriage relationship. Their peers might be communicating something differently. In the media, I mean, we all know that media is very over-sexualized, and there's this incredibly high value on being sexy. And so then when youth are being encountering all these different values, all these different messages about sex and sexuality, it's hard for them, of course. And so because there's all these different value systems, it's difficult for everyone to get together. There's also a whole variety of fears that surround adolescent sexuality. One is that there's going to be generational differences. The older generation values this, but that young generation doesn't value, they don't care what we value. When in reality, research shows that parents, guardians, have an incredible impact on how youth develop their values. Peers definitely have a huge influence, but it's more on things like their music and their clothing and things like that, not so much the core values. Secondly, there's this huge fear that if we give youth the freedom to actually engage in conversations and discover their own sexuality, they're not going to make good choices. They're going to go out, they're going to do all the things that they shouldn't do. When in reality, teenagers actually have this incredible ability to make health-promoting choices. And finally, about why it's so hard is that there's a worry that discussion will promote the activity. If we tell them about using condoms, well, they're going to use condoms. If we tell them about birth control, they're going to use that. And so, I mean, in some ways, it's like, well, that would be good. But the idea is that there's this huge fear that talking about it will increase behavior. And again, a final note is that there's a challenge to talking and dealing or helping adolescent sexuality development because of differing community values, whether that's religious, whether that's parenting style. Some people view, oh, sexuality, that is a family matter. Don't discuss that with my kid. These are a variety of the challenges that are faced when engaging with sexuality development. And typically there's been one main response, and that is sexual education, typically done in public schools. And this is done with two goals: one, to provide information, and secondly, to delay sexual activity or to increase healthy sexual behaviors. In the 80s, this was shown to change knowledge, increase knowledge, but didn't actually impact attitudes, behaviors. In the 90s, specifically during Clinton's era, there was, monogamy in a marriage relationship. This was the norm that was presented, and there was an abstinence-only type teaching. And so, just to quickly clarify, there are kind of three strains of sexual education. One is abstinence-only, which is there's not so much any education; it's more just you're not to have sex until marriage, and that is the norm. That is how things should be. Then there's abstinence-based, which is more comprehensive. It has more education, but still is heavily promoting abstinence. And finally, comprehensive sexuality education is providing information, providing the resources, providing the tools for youth. Of note on that, there's little evidence supporting that abstinence-only programs or approaches have much effect at actually delaying or promoting healthy sexual behaviors. And so what does work when it comes to working with youth, with adolescents and their sexuality? Well, positive youth development programs. Indicators of effective programs in promoting healthy behaviors have an emphasis on education, employment, and life options. They address cognitive and social skills, social norms and values. They set clear goals and values, and they're ongoing and involve diverse experiential methods. It doesn't really sound much like a sexual education program, and that's because these are not. They are focused on life. They're focused on this holistic development. And it's this type of program that leads to positive, healthy sexual health outcomes. And those health outcomes are such as postponed sexual activity, a reduced risk of pregnancy or parenthood, reduced risk of illness or infections. And another key to this positive youth development model, as we've looked at throughout the semester, is caring adults. And so caring adults help young people clarify their sexual identities. They provide education and experience to assist in healthy decision-making. And they also help youth. They guide adolescents through all the different competing values I've talked about, and hopefully get them to achieve at least this bare minimum of a value towards healthy sexual expression that says it is consensual, it is non-exploitative, it's honest, it's pleasurable, and it's protected against disease and unintended pregnancy. That is the bare minimum that we're shooting for when we're working with youth. And so the chapter closes on some action steps towards implementation. One is that as individuals, we need to be aware of where we are, what we value, what we're comfortable with, and what we actually know. We need to know about how youth develop sexually as well as in all other ways. Secondly, we need to look at, if we're part of an institution, like, well, what has the institution organization done in the past? What are their values? And then additionally, if there is a bit of resistance, there's a need to educate about the need for sexual education, for sexuality development. And then thirdly, on a community level, there's a need to build a network of community stakeholders. There's a need to involve youth as assets. They need to be part of their own development, again, in all ways, not just their sexuality. And thirdly, there's, again, a need to educate the community as to the importance of this. As an application, I looked quickly at the BC, at my home province and their sexual education. And a lot of their mandates under their BC Teachers Federation line up very much with this positive youth development focus as far as helping them develop values, a more holistic view of sexuality, not just about reproduction. It also emphasizes that youth are able to make those safe decisions and it also emphasizes that it's inclusive. Some concerns that were raised by some other experts is that the curriculum might be a bit too vague and that there's a lack of teacher training. Teachers might not actually be fully equipped to do this teaching, as well as it's kind of hit or miss whether you have a good teacher or a bad teacher. And thirdly, or secondly, I guess, as far as concerns is the lack of caring adult guidance. There might be education, but due to like the teacher-student relationship, there's not the ability to walk alongside the youth and kind of navigate all of the information that they just received. A second application would be in the current youth programs that I'm involved with. And when we look back at the effective programs for promoting healthy sexual development, our program is that. It is life skills, it's social skills, emotional skills, and it's a lot of supports in those areas as well. And we have actually engaged in some sexuality development before. We've done online safety courses, we've done sexual integrity or pregnancy option courses, and we've also, the most recent effort was bringing together a whole bunch of adults to do a sexuality question panel where youth could bring any of their questions and engage and ask them openly and to have a discussion. However, to improve this application due to this positive youth development framework, there is a need for more staff education. There's a need to clarify what exactly are our values and what are the values of our community. And thirdly, there's a need to just kind of keep going, to keep pushing away, to realize the importance of this as part of our regular programming. Third application is in the need for increased mentorship. There was a study done by Monago, Ward, and Aldana that showed that the influence from peers and parents during their crucial developmental stages have a huge influence on their sexual values and behaviors. And so, again, the value, or all these different competing value systems are out there and they're being communicated to youth. And so there's a need for us as adults to partner with youth, not just in providing programs and providing education, but partner with them in navigating their different values, all the different values that are given to them, as well as discovering all the options that are available to them. But in that, to be aware of our own personal values and not force that on the child, but to walk alongside with them, be honest, present it, but not force any set way of being and set way of developing sexually for that youth. At the bottom here, I have a quote which I think is the crux of everything, that sexuality is often the dimension of adolescents' lives for which adults' guidance and support is absent. And I think that is so much what we're missing as far as developing our youth. Finally, we come around to what the Bible, what Scripture has to say about adolescent sexuality. And from my own personal experience, I just remember growing up in the church and just constantly being bombarded with the warnings against sexual immorality. These behaviors are not okay. And while I think there's importance in that, because there is a need, God put it in the Scripture for a reason, there is a need for that communication. It is this deficit focus. It focuses on the problem behaviors. Always focusing on the negative can be a barrier to discussing what healthy sexuality would look like, as well as the religion has often been used as a basis for these abstinence-only programs. And as I discussed earlier, these have proven to not be all that successful. Another thing to note is that during the time that Scripture was, there wasn't this same sexual social maturity gap that we're dealing with now. At the time of sexual maturity, social maturity, they were very much hand in hand. So as a conclusion to what the Bible has to say, I found, and again, this was difficult for me to discover what Scripture does have to say about adolescent sexuality, because it talks about sexuality as a whole, but not specifically for youth. God made humans to be sexual beings. We see that right at the very beginning, that Adam and Eve were made to be together. They were made of one flesh. As well as we see in Luke 2:52 and 1 Samuel that young people are meant to grow holistically. They grew in wisdom and stature, and they grew in favor with God and man. It's this holistic growth, and sexuality is part of that. To neglect that is a disservice to our youth. And finally, just everything that I read just just really points that sexuality is about this unity. Often so much the warning against sexual immorality is because it is not the unity that God intended. So there's this sexuality that leads to unity and oneness, and that's what's depicted in Scripture. And Paul talks about how it's a profound mystery, and he's talking about Christ and the church. There's the sexual relationship, sexuality that humans experience. Paul somehow compares that to what Christ and the church shares. And so if we help our youth to develop healthy sexually, there's something there that they get to experience when they experience it the way God intended, that gives them insight into him and into his relationship with us. And it's beautiful, it's confusing, it's messy, it's a mystery, but we need to walk alongside our youth in developing their sexuality. And so thanks for listening. I don't know how long this one took me. Hopefully it was a lot shorter. Here are the references. Yeah, thanks again.